Hello all. In today's lecture, we will turn to the complex issues of the wave of anti-Semitism in late 19th century Europe and the emergence of the modern Zionist movement. To understand both phenomena, however, it is important to first discuss the wave of nationalism Europe experienced in the half-century preceding the First World War and the expanding field of scientific racism that was popular at the time. The liberal and nationalist movements throughout the first half of the 19th century in Europe had preached the right for every group of people on the continent to rule themselves in their own independent republics. These groups, or nations, were most usually defined by their language, and indeed, languages such as Italian were standardized and popularized by writers and intellectuals looking to tie all those that they considered to be Italians together into one cohesive whole. The nationalist movements culminated in the unification wars of the mid-19th century, when the new nations of Germany and Italy were born, and Hungary received a degree of nationhood as part of Austria-Hungary. Nationalism was not just seen as morally correct, it was seen as the most efficient modern means of running a state. Rather than living in harmony, as some liberals had predicted that they would, Europe's nations began to compete with one another for land and power. The Alsace-Lorraine issue is notable here, as there could be no rapprochement between France and Germany, whilst the Germans continued to hold lands that the French believed had been unjustly taken from them in the Franco-Prussian War. Moreover, European nation-states began a race in Africa and in Asia to acquire as many colonies as they could in order to strengthen their empires, boost their economic might, and supposedly secure themselves from future threats. Britain was the preeminent colonial power, but France and Germany too actively struggled to build up their empires, partly as a means to strengthen what was referred to at the time as their race, by which was meant not white or Caucasian, but French or German. Europe's obsession with nation-states left a number of groups in an awkward position. On the one hand, old multi-ethnic empires such as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire now found themselves faced with problems of national insurgency and instability within their borders. On the other hand, nationalism also posed a conundrum to ethnic and linguistic groups who lacked a concentrated population or a historic national homeland. Of these groups, the most prominent were the Jewish and the Roma people. It was made clear to both groups that they were increasingly unwelcome in the new national states that were emerging at the time. At the same time as nationalism became increasingly prominent, a new science was justifying the supposed difference between the world's races. Scientific racism, a movement pioneered through a warped version of the research of British biologist Sir Charles Darwin, argued that some races were naturally superior to others, or at least that they could be improved to be superior to others. Since race was often conflated with ethnicity, this meant that groups such as the Irish or Jewish people began to be referred to as innately inferior to other people of Europe and an impediment to their progress and improvement. Anti-Jewish sentiment had, of course, existed for centuries in Europe, and massacres of Jewish populations were common during the medieval and early modern eras. These attacks had, however, focused on the idea of Judaism as a religion. Now Jewish people were attacked as an ethnic group or even as a race, as they clearly did not fit, so their persecutors claimed, with the rest of the nation. Moreover, unscrupulous populist politicians began to harvest distrust and dislike of Jewish people to gain votes in elections as electoral franchises expanded. This phenomenon was particularly notable in Germany and Austria. In 1879, German agitator and racist Wilhelm Marr founded the so-called League of Anti-Semites, which called for the destruction of Judaism. Although his movement failed to gain much traction, Marr introduced the term anti-Semitism into the popular lexicon, although he meant it to mean a good or even a noble cause. As we have seen, Jewish people were targeted in a series of attacks or pogroms in the Russian Empire, where they were also forbidden from buying property or even living outside of the Pale of Settlement. Nonetheless, in Central and Western Europe, Jewish people were more assimilated into mainstream culture and felt themselves more secure from anti-Jewish attacks. Jewish leaders called for ever more assimilation as a way of earning the gratitude and respect of their Gentile neighbors. Anti-Semitic rabble-rousers were seen as troubling, but overall as weak and powerless, and Jewish leaders encouraged their communities to go on with life as normal. In Vienna, Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl was one of the most prominent voices calling for further assimilation in his reporting for the city's biggest newspaper, the New Free Press. The Dreyfus Affair shocked these assimilationist Jewish leaders to their core. The false accusation that a Jewish captain in the French army, Alfred Dreyfus, had given secrets to the hated Germans led to a guilty verdict, Dreyfus's exile to a South American prison colony, and a wave of anti-Semitism breaking out throughout France. When radicals and socialists attempted to overturn the obviously wrong guilty verdict, the anti-Semitic tide grew even more virulent, with deputies in the French Parliament itself denouncing crazy cooked-up Jewish conspiracies and calling for a crackdown on the supposed Jewish influence in the country. Herzl, who was in Paris to report for his newspaper, could not believe the events that he was observing. Republican France, Europe's supposed protector of liberty and equality, had crumbled in the face of an anti-Semitic wave. If Jewish people could not be protected in France, then it was clear to Herzl that they were not safe anywhere and needed their own nation-state. Thus was born the modern Zionist movement. Herzl was a tall, imposing man with a strong black beard. A gifted orator and writer, he carried something of the aura of a prophet about him. Following the publication of his pamphlet The Jewish State in 1896, he thus quickly was able to assemble around him a group of adherents who formed the nucleus of the Zionist political movement. Herzl argued that the time had come to lay the preparations for a return to the ancient Jewish homeland of Palestine and reform the Kingdom of Israel. When he first told friends and confidants of his plan, many laughed at him and declared it an impossible dream. Nonetheless, Herzl was able to win over enough adherents that he was able to hold the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, in 1797. To rapturous applause, Herzl described his dream to the crowd, in an event reported around the world. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state, he wrote in his diary after the event. In 50 years, everyone will see it. For the time being, however, the restoration of the Kingdom of Israel seemed a long way off. The Jewish population in 19th century Palestine was tiny, mostly confined to the backwater city of Jerusalem. Palestine itself was a poor and insignificant province in the Muslim Ottoman Empire, which had no interest at all in creating a Jewish state. Nonetheless, slowly, Jewish settlers and refugees began to arrive in Palestine and create agricultural communes or kibbutzim. Their efforts were funded by wealthy financiers, both Jewish and millenarian Christians, who hoped that the establishment of a Jewish Israel would accelerate the end times and thus the return of Christ and their own ascension to paradise. Jewish agricultural colonies were not only founded in Palestine, but also in South America. Herzl and the Zionists were popular amongst the impoverished Jewish population of London's East End, and they used this popularity to petition the British authorities to allow them to create a colony in British-run Egypt. The British, fearing the security of Egypt rejected this plan, but in 1903 offered the Zionists 6,000 square miles of land in Uganda, about the size of today's West Bank, Palestine, which they claimed was unpopulated. Herzl was willing to accept, but Jewish communities in Eastern Europe pressured him to reject the offer. Nowhere in the Jewish holy texts did it say, after all, anything about Uganda. Even after Herzl's early death in 1904, the Zionist movement continued to grow. It was especially popular with poorer Jewish people, not only in London, but mostly in Eastern Europe and in Austria-Hungary, with the center of the movement for many years being in Vienna. Zionists formed their own clubs, newspapers, and sports teams. They attended the same coffee shops and communicated across international borders. For the time being, however, they remained very much a minority in the Jewish community. Assimilation remained the watchword of the day. Meanwhile, the people of Vienna elected a notorious anti-Semite and populist Karl Lueger as their mayor in 1897. For the next 13 years, Lueger would combine measures to aid the Viennese poor with an open and proud anti-Semitism in order to secure his grip on the city. It was during this time that a young Adolf Hitler moved to Vienna, where he undoubtedly came into contact with some of Lueger's ideas. Following the pogroms which erupted in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century that we covered in the last lecture, a document was claimed to be discovered that detailed a plan for Jewish world domination. This document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was spread by members of the anti-Semitic Black Hundreds, who claimed that they had stolen it from a secret Jewish organization. It was, of course, a forgery, but that didn't stop it from sweeping through Europe and being translated into dozens of languages. It seemed to anti-Semites to justify their terrible beliefs. Something clearly had to be done about the Jewish problem. The governments of the world did little to stop the proliferation of the text. Whilst the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, did order copies to be confiscated, he acknowledged that anti-Semitism was a good cause, an acknowledgement that perhaps did much to prevent any serious censorship from taking place. Zionism was not destined to succeed, and indeed, until 1914, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine appeared farcical. However, Herzl had laid the foundations of a powerful and well-backed political movement that was able to take advantage from the chaos of the early 20th century. In 1914, the British and Ottoman empires went to war. To help them in the conflict, the British promised a number of interested parties sections of the Ottoman Empire in a future peace settlement. The Arabs were promised independence, the French lands in Syria and Lebanon, and, in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the Jewish people were promised a new homeland. When, in the end, following a successful invasion, the British simply took the land themselves, the stage was set for a battle between a number of different groups that would come to define the violent upheavals of interwar Palestine.